Jon Feingold, welcome to the LYHL podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you here. I'm really excited just to see where the conversation takes us today. With what I know about you, I think you're just going to have so many valuable insights to offer.
Thanks. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, so just a little bit of reference to listeners is that I know Jon just almost I would say kind of like peripherally or marginally through your partner and that was back from Los Angeles days and you're now on the East Coast and so I'm just really excited to hear what you have to say today.
Thanks. Yeah, the LA days seem far away in part because a pandemic hit. But yeah, a lot of good LA memories.
I know. Well, things are still carrying on here, so do come back whenever, absolutely. Well, and I'd love to hear, just we'll launch right into the questions that kind of guide our conversation. And so, Jon, how would you describe your work and vocation?
I am a law professor. So the reason I left LA is because I got a job at Boston University School of Law. And so I've been here now just over 3 years. And so, yes, that's my job. And happy to talk about the details. But yeah, so I'm right now sitting in the BU Law Tower looking over the Charles River.
Sounds beautiful. Is it beautiful right now in February, or is it a little rough?
So, I mean, today's overcast and it's the mix of the climate emergency giving you 65-degree days that sort of feel beautiful, but also are concerning, and you wish it was actually a foot of snow on the ground and 12 degrees. But
Yeah,
yeah.
it's strange because in LA, I don't know if you check in on the weather, but today was like a low of 39 and
Whoa.
yeah, we've got some highs in the 50s and 40s this coming week. And that's kind of how it's been in general since November. So we're having very wintry. There's been zero beach days since November, and it's very like, what is going on for sure? Um, so can you tell us a little bit more about your work and kind of what interests you, like in terms of what you're doing now, and then maybe just kind of like your journey to where you're at and kind of passions that you have?
Yeah, totally. So, and this sort of takes me back to LA because
Yeah.
I went to law school at UCLA, not because I'd ever been to LA before. I mean, I grew up in Massachusetts and hadn't really ever thought that real people lived in LA. But uh, UCLA is at the time, and maybe still is, the only law school in the country that has a formal specialization in critical race studies, which
Hmm.
is an area of study that most people had never really heard about a couple years ago, but now has received a lot of unfortunate attention. And so, yeah, so I went to UCLA for that program, and that has so interests in race and racism have always, been at the forefront of my interests, and it led to a few different things between law school and here. But now at BU, much of my scholarship and research is informed by critical race theory. And yeah, so that's always something that I'm thinking about and writing about. And the classes that I teach include property law, which is a standard first year course, which I think most students, presume is going to be dry and boring and maybe based on some arcane feudal
Sure,
law,
sure.
um, but is in many ways a story of American racism because it is rooted, our
Yeah.
property law regime is rooted in conquest and slavery. And so there's few things that you can talk about now without finding some connection, some more direct, some more attenuated to that sort of moment in which the country's foundation was forged. And so part of, yeah, and so I'm teaching property law right now. My students have a midterm on Tuesday, so we'll have a
Hmm.
review session tomorrow. And yeah, that's sort of what's going on these days.
That So there's a lot packed into there. Because I think some good things happened to you in LA. So I think you found some real people in LA. Uh, um, and I didn't realize that about UCLA. Did you say it's the only or was the only?
So at least at the time, it was the only law school in the country that had a formal specialization in critical race studies. There were certainly other institutions that had, opportunities to take classes that were really intentionally taught from a critical race perspective. And it's possible that now maybe one or two other schools have a formal specialization
Sure.
on those lines. But at best, at most, it's a handful, and maybe it's still only UCLA.
Yeah. Um, as a white male, like how did you come to have like this interest and passion, want that specialization?
So it's a good question. I mean, I've always been sort of intuitively curious about race and racism um and actually when I was so I went to Vassar for college, small liberal
Mm-hmm.
arts school about an hour and a half north of New York City, and studied abroad in South Africa in Cape Town in the fall of my junior year, in part because, if you're for whatever reason interested in this thing called race, South Africa is a place that has a very particular racial history and racial story, and so that's what attracted me there. But then serendipitously, when I was back for the spring semester of my junior year, I ended up in this constitutional law class, in part because also like part of me was like, I don't know, maybe law school down the road or law, that
Mm-hmm.
seems sort of interesting. And it just, happened that the person who taught the class is this incredible guy named Luke Harris, who's still a professor at Vassar, who co-founded this think tank called the African American Policy Forum with this other person named Kim Crenshaw. And he taught a class that was really a class on affirmative action from a critical race perspective. And so it was the first time. So I was, I don't know, 21 or so when I was exposed to a lot
Mm-hmm.
of the sort of foundational concepts and theories and ideas that make up this large, diffuse body of um, scholarship and intellectual inquiry that is critical race theory. And it just offered me vocabulary and language to better make sense of the world that I was in. And so it was super, I'm also a sort of nerdy guy. And so it was very nourishing just in an analytical way, but it was also, if you have a particular experience, but you don't have the vocabulary to name it, it can be, disorienting or just hard to. There's just something really grounding and powerful in being able to name and have words to describe the life that we live. And critical
Mm-hmm.
race theory has always helped me do that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think for me, what one thing that is interesting now looking back is that when I entered law school in 2000, the fall of 2009, um, and maybe predictably uh non-humble way,
I'm curious
I
what
was
you have
like,
about this
I was
lab.
like, man, I'm an expert on this stuff. Like I get like what more is like, I took this set my class in college at Vassar with this expert. I've read all the things. And every day now I'm just like, man, there's so much, I know so much less than I do. And it's all just, after, so what is it, 2023? So it would have been 2006. So yeah, almost, you know, over 15 years later from that class, it's like, man, I'm still trying to figure this stuff out. And so it's been
Mm-hmm.
really, um, in a sense, maybe humbling, but also just, um, there's something very settling in appreciating how complex the world is and how
Mm-hmm.
often we tend to just revert to very simplistic and just simplistic lay theories, don't necessarily have anything to do with the empirical reality of the world that we live in, but dictate so much of how we experience and respond to the world. And so I just feel super privileged to be able to have a job where I get to continue, you know, engaging this space where on the one hand it's all about ideas, but it's also about fighting for just the basic dignity for most people in a country that is, you know, in the worst sort of way, reverting to some of its, most violent and grotesque uh, elements.
Yeah. Ooh, um, I think there's a lot of places we could go. I'd like to give you the opportunity, and not that you need it, but to the people that listen to, um, and not that it's not available out there and that there's not resources, but for people that are listening that are hearing different things about critical race theory, like how would you describe it?
So I think, certainly a really good question for anyone who's like, man, what is this term? Why is it getting so much buzz? So, and yeah, there's a lot of really good literature out there. I host my own little podcasty thing called Race Class, which they're very quick, like 25-minute episodes that if someone's just wants to hear what some random guy who thinks of himself as an aspiring critical race theorist, how he talks about and thinks about race, that's an easy way to do it. But one just very basic way to sort of think about critical race theory, and so it comes out of law schools and law professors, um, majority of whom are professors of color, though not only professors of color, who are grappling in the 70s and 80s with this really key question. Why is it that we do not seem to be solving racial inequality, even though racial discrimination is now prohibited? And so it's this conundrum. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act 1965, we have these laws that are making it unlawful to discriminate on the basis of race. But the material reality on the ground isn't changing. And so why is that? Like, it seems simple enough that if you prohibit racial discrimination, then you're going to be able to actually transcend out of, this, you know, essentially period of American apartheid into one where you actually get racial equality. So it's really just meant to be a sort of starts from a fundamental, sort of basic question. And then there's other, tenets of critical race theory, including that race is a social construct, which we can talk more about, and that generally racism is more structural than it is individual, and that subject position matters. So whether as a function of your own sort of experience and identity, you will literally perceive the same set of facts differently. So there's all these insights that are, um, on the one hand, asking the question, why haven't we actually moved closer to this aspiration of a substantively meaningful multiracial democracy, um, when we've outlawed discrimination, but then also really longing for a far richer, deeper, um, just thicker understanding of this thing called race, which is this term that we sort of toss around. I think a lot of people have pretty strong feelings about it and feel
Mm-hmm.
entitled to those feelings because I don't know, they have a like quote unquote have a race and so therefore they're an expert. We also like, I don't know, are made up of matter. I certainly am not an expert on physics or, you know, um, like gravity affects me. I can't jump that high. Uh, but like not like you have to have complete a PhD in physics to be able to get a plane off the ground. Um, and so there's all these, like sort of like I don't know, paradoxes or conundrums or just contradictions when it comes to race. And part of, I think for many people who would identify as critical race theorists, part of the task is just becoming more sophisticated and thoughtful, talking about this thing that continues to shape arguably every aspect of our public and private lives. but generally we lack even a basic vocabulary to just, like what are the right questions to ask? Um, and in a moment where increasingly it's taboo to even talk about race or think about race, and um, yeah, and so for me, critical race theory is it's no more or less modest um, or moderate than any other intellectual or political tradition that is trying to like simultaneously make sense of the world and all the injustices in it, while also, trying to move closer to this aspiration that I think is real, though we've never actually realized of, like what would a truly egalitarian, multiracial nation look like? Um, and then, having to contend with the power that racism in itself, obviously a term that deserves to be unpacked in all sorts of ways, continues to hold over um, this country. And yeah, and yeah, and so for me, being in spaces and classes that were really taking seriously the need to think about racial equality, not just as like some moral good that we want, but also a deeply challenging intellectual question or challenge, was always, nourishing, in a lot of ways, and where I always just sort of felt at home.
Hmm. Thank you for that overview, and I'm excited. I'm definitely going to give a follow to your podcast. So race class, right?
Race class.
Okay, amazing. So I'm super glad you mentioned that. I relate as well to what you mentioned previously about the more you know, like the more you know, the less you know. I did within my specialty, like fellowship is higher level training, and I just felt like I was all that, right? And then the more you go, just so you're like, oh, okay, there's the human body, which is my area of like, that's what I focus on, right? Healing and there's just so much to know, and that there's so little that we even know about the brain, um, and that it ties in, I think, even to when we talk about like just human behavior. So if we're talking about racism or uh, there's so much just underlying, yeah, why humans do what they do and why we treat each other so poorly in certain instances and can be so compassionate and kind in others. So we could for sure just talk and we'll just see how this integrates into additional questions. But I really appreciate that. And I'm glad that people have resources. And if you have any other resources that you'd like to provide, I can put that in the show notes to point towards people. Yeah, if there's
So
anything you want to
here,
rattle
I'll just,
off.
so on
Yeah,
my
yeah.
bookshelf, so Victor Ray, I really should know where he's a professor. Where are you? Uh, for some reason, I can't even pull it quickly. But he wrote this great sort of primer on critical race theory, that is a really, really accessible text for non-lawyers, for non, academics to understand what is this body of scholarship. And he and I share not just interest in the subject matter, but a little like our own sort of trajectories. He also went to Vassar. And I, again, like I should know this, but I assume that that was probably at least a point in his life when he was exposed to critical race theory, and now is
Mm-hmm.
doing super groundbreaking work of his own.
Cool, cool. I look forward to reading that. Thank you for that recommendation. And yeah, I think you can be. We don't need to know everything about everybody else. That's part of like how I even structure this. Is I don't necessarily do my research. I just sit down and let people present themselves however they want to, and it's just a joy to hear that unfolding versus like, okay, how are you going to do on Jeopardy when they ask you like what university you went to? Um, all right. So, second question that we like to discuss here at the LYHL podcast is what do you think it means to live your healthiest life?
That is such a brutal
Just a light
question
one,
to
just
ask.
light.
And I mean, so I don't know. I guess there's a few ways that I can respond to that question, but it really is just hard to 3 years plus into this pandemic that has flipped everything upside down in all sorts of ways, where we're simultaneously still living through or dying through or being sick through the consequences of it, but are sort of, you know, collectively in lots of different ways over it and acting like it's not real or taking different sort of precautions or not. Um, but yeah, so I guess that's just the opening caveat that it's
Hmm.
particularly hard to think about it. But I guess for me, so I often think of and this maybe is part of the like the critical race theory piece, but both thinking in terms of individually, like for
Hmm.
me, or what do I think is important for individuals
Yep.
to do in
Yep.
order to, live their healthiest life. But then, like structurally, like communally,
Hmm.
what is the context or the structures that we need in order to actually be able to live healthy, dignified lives? And at least for me, like increasingly my sense is it doesn't matter what your sort of how disciplined you are, what your work ethic is, or how committed you are. If life is not structured in a way that actually is going to enable you to have access to the things that you need to be healthy, then maybe not game over, but you got to be pretty heroic to get the things you need. And for me, something else that's really, I think, shifted my thinking and also, been another moment of humility is Um, so I have a 3.5-year-old, and I I have since realized that I judged people with kids in a lot of ways. That was not, it was, super, it was not fair. Um, it was also a really, healthy and helpful reminder that no matter what you might know about something intellectually, there is a difference of actually going through it and experiencing it. Where you can read as many books as you want on early childhood development, but until you're dealing with that, you know, that child going through early childhood development, it's just can't understand everything. And of course, that's not to say that everyone has the same experience. Experience is, going to be varied in all sorts of ways. Um, but I guess the reason why I sort of meandered into the kid piece is that I think it's very easy to struggle to balance so work life, relationships, everything you got to do in a healthy way when there is no other human that is dependent on you for their survival. But then when, at least for me, after having a kid, it really makes it so much more difficult to get the things that you need as the adult to be healthy. And part of the reason is because in this country, we do not support parents. Like,
Hmm.
there's so
Yeah.
many ways in which our, whether it has to do with parental leave, whether it has to do with very differential expectations as to whether the parent is um, male or female, just in terms of what's expected and then what's problematic or not problematic, and just all the gendered ways in which, or the ways in which parenting is uh, gendered. Um, but yeah, and so like for me to be healthy, I think it's probably pretty similar for most people. Like I need to eat food that doesn't poison me. Uh, and most of the food that is easiest to access in the United States is poison.
Hmm.
Like, and I say that somewhat flippantly, but but
No,
not
yeah.
really. I mean,
No,
like
yeah.
so much of the like food that is, it's you have to often have time and resources to get food that's actually going to help your body and not
Yeah.
just further crush you. Um, and of course, there's also like whole web and network of public and private um, interests that make it easier or harder for people to get just food. Um, But yeah, so and just as like a sort of side note trajectory, when I was in law school, my, like probably most people, my energy was like all over the place. Like I'd crash during the middle of the day, then like, whatever.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and a friend of mine who I became really close with, he had done CrossFit and other stuff and was like in different communities of folks who were doing different, just thinking about food differently. He was like, dude, just stop eating bread. I was like, why would I stop eating bread? I love bread. I've for
Yeah.
years planned on opening a like every type of bread type substance sandwich joint
Oh,
because it's
that's
the
like a love. Okay. That's like next level bread love.
yeah, like I like,
Yeah.
it's and he's like, no, don't eat the bread. It's, it's leading to, it's there's the gluten stuff and the sugar stuff, and it's just leading to spikes and crashes. And so I stopped eating bread. And in ways that, and I've always been skeptical of food and diet stuff that always to me has felt somewhat gimmicky. And,
Hmm.
that probably says more about me than anything else. But I was also skeptical, like how much does like gluten, like, but I'm totally a believer. Like my, at least for me, not eating bread shifted, like led to a pretty big shift in how my body felt and just like stability with respect to energy. And it's not to say that I don't eat bread. Like now, like I do, but I rarely will buy it for myself. I certainly still um like um consume my fair share of poison. Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
but I'm really fortunate in that like I make enough money, and notwithstanding the fact that housing is pretty much unaffordable in most places in this country, that I've
Hmm.
got enough disposable income where I can, buy food that is good for me. And I also um, you know, figured out had time to get comfortable in a kitchen and make my own food. And so like, you know, so which is just to say that I'm lucky that I'm able to avoid poison generally. And I also don't actually have much of a sweet tooth. So
Hmm.
sort of sugar is not something that um I have to like struggle with. But so yes, like food's important, sleep. For
Hmm.
me, one of the earliest things personally that I realized is that I just need more sleep than I think the average person, and it was
Hmm.
something that I needed to prioritize for health.
Yeah,
Um,
same here. Yeah.
Having a kid totally can mess that up. Uh, but yeah, I think that we are for a lot of people, probably maybe the world, this country, acculturated into um lifestyles and habits that justify sacrificing certain things um, in order to be able to do or get other things. And I think sleep is something that's often sacrificed. And I don't know, it's something that my body does not deal with well. And so, yeah, like I go to bed super early in a way where my like high school self would be super embarrassed by. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Um, and then, so yeah, like for me, so food is key. Sleep is key. Uh, Working out is key.
Mm.
Maybe for me more than food and sleep. Something both physically, also, emotionally, cognitively. And I don't actually know anything about any of this stuff except that, like, if I go a few days without being able, it I start to feel it in different sorts of ways. But in this life that I'm currently in, where I have limited time and a kid who, you know, is 3.5, but apparently still relies on me for a lot of things, means that for the past couple of years, I've been waking up around 5 a lot of mornings to work out. And I
Hmm.
also, there was a point in my life when I was like, why do people wake up so early to go to the gym? Like I would get to the gym sometimes at 6:30 which was way too early then, and people would be leaving, and I'm
Mm.
like, what? It's like you
Who are
don't
these
have to
people?
make that choice. And now I'm embodying that person that I was judging.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
which again, maybe all just a reflection of me in different sorts of ways. But it is, yeah, like my spouse and I like have a lot of conversations on the different trade-offs that we make and trying to navigate a life where time is so precious. And yeah, like if I'm gonna be exhausted, or if I'm gonna get an extra hour of sleep, or if I'm gonna work out, which probably also means pulling, tweaking something in my back, because I'm certainly not investing in any recovery or
Mm-hmm.
like, cool down or stretching post workout. It is like get loose enough to do something that's, 18% chance of leading to injury and then run home. Um,
Uh, you're
yeah,
you're tickling
it's
the physical therapist, yeah.
yeah, no, it's like it's not the recipe for um yeah, total balance. And then,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, so for me, if I were, I'm just listing off things that I think individually are important, but that I think we actually cannot reliably access unless structurally there's a setup for it, including like super accessible, affordable childcare, which,
Mm-hmm.
like if parents were, like if there really were a quote unquote parents' rights movement, it would be one that was ensuring that all parents could have childcare for $10 a month. And obviously, the wealthiest country in the history of the earth has resources that could make it possible for all parents to have childcare for $10 a month if the political will were there. But
Mm-hmm.
different conversation. And the last thing for me, I guess, is, the meaningful um, human contact and relationships.
Yeah.
And which I think, yeah, one of the hardest aspects of the past 3 years, from sure a lot of people, certainly me, was how isolating life became through the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic, and particularly where for, 15 years or so of my life. Is that right? Yeah, doing the math. Eating communal meals, prepping and eating communal meals with other
Mm-hmm.
people had just become a staple. In
Mm-hmm.
part because I do think there's something that is so, you know, um, yeah, just, I don't know, nourishing, I guess is the word I often
Mm-hmm.
default to, but about being able to be with people around food,
Yeah.
especially cooking it, making it.
Yeah.
Um, Oftentimes turns out that a little bit of alcohol can like, uh make it even more lively and relaxed and stuff. Yeah, and that was just sort of cut out. And
Mm.
apparently we are social beings. And
Mm-hmm.
no and so the same friend who sort of turned me onto the less gluten diet um would also say something like it's like who you're with, not where you're at. One of those sorts of things. I would always be like, nah, it's actually where you're at. Like, I'd much rather be somewhere than somewhere else. But I think he's right. Like,
Mm.
if you've got the right people around you, you can make a lot pretty, great. But no matter where you're at, if you're just, you know, doing it solo, limits to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like so much yeah, you're hitting a lot of like what I think too, like our kind of pillars of just healthy human living. And it's an interesting, yeah, it's very interesting the perspective that you're bringing about just structurally and communally. And I'm definitely interested in seeing like how that plays out as we continue to talk. And if you have any kind of suggestions for that. I was this is not very well processed because, well, I think this is why I have this podcast, right? Is because I think a lot about like what it means to lead a healthy life. And so it's just fun to draw people into the conversation and see what perspectives that they have. But I was thinking last night of the interaction between individual and communal, individual, like, and well, that's it, basically. And there seemed to be like a framework for me. And I don't know if you're familiar with I was thinking about the Enneagram. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's like um, it just talks about like it's a human archetypal system. Like it's a way that you can um, understand human behavior and understand your own behavior is really the essence of it is kind of like self analyzing, see what motivates you. Cause I think we all behave in ways that we don't intend to or like in kind of regret. And so it's kind of a useful tool for that. So I don't want to get like too far into that, but there's basically like three triads that it can be organized in that everybody has, we can operate, and everybody has access to this. So the head center, a heart center, and a gut center. And basically, so on an individual level, we tend to operate in one or the other. So you and I seem to be more intellectual, kind of. We're probably like in our head a lot. But for us to be healthier, and I'm sorry, I apologize if you don't identify this way, but maybe I need to get more in touch. For me, I'll switch back to me. So I need to get maybe more in touch with my emotions, or I need to trust my intuition more. And increasingly, I do that, and I think that that's made me a healthier person. I'll still like have the bias towards. I really enjoy thought processes and thinking through why things are the way they are, but that needs to not be like how I just go through the world. If I do, my life is pretty limited, right? It limits me from love. It limits me from those just the wisdom that an intuition, right? You can just, you're like, I can't explain. I just know that this is the right thing to do. And for the first time, I made the connection to me that seems like really, so I have to process this. It's been about 12 hours, right? Since I really started to think about it. But I think you can overlay that if that's like a human healthy is like that we're integrated in these ways and we can operate in all these centers. I think you could probably analyze organizations or cultures that way. And it just really kind of shows you, because you have all the other things you can look at, like morally or legally. But if you look at like what a society values, is it just like all up? Like I feel like we're a pretty like intellectual society, like in the US or like Western culture, that there's not this heart of really caring for one another. And there's not as much of well, this is the right thing to do. Well, how do you know that? I know it because I know. And that's why I'm behaving ethically. And, I don't have to go through a theory per se to know that that's just how people should be treated. Right. So it kind of makes me, I appreciate what you're saying about like the structural, and it's just helping, it's getting things pinging around in my head. And if there's anything you'd want to share right off the cuff, but I'm interested in seeing if you have any thoughts as we go about that, what you're pointing towards more structurally and healthier living.
So, I guess one of the reasons why I, intentionally highlight the structural piece is that I think that living in the United States, you are constantly having to both resist and fight back against different sort of national mythologies
Mm-hmm.
that are tied to, individualism, work ethic, pulling oneself up by their bootstraps, which is,
Mm-hmm.
really, I think many of us are acculturated into
Mm-hmm.
notions that whether or not one lives, with the security of sort of wealth in this country is a function of individual attributes. And that's a really um, powerful story that I personally think is just empirically fraught in all sorts of ways. But it does lead to, uh, I think, um, if we are overly focused on individuals, then, um, or sort of this an individualist frame, then if the problem that you've identified is that parents are not sleeping enough, then the
Mm-hmm.
questions that you're going to ask is, well, what are these parents doing wrong? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what is it that these parents are not doing that they could be doing? What are the choices that
Mm-hmm.
they're making that they shouldn't be making, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to like widening your lens and asking, so structurally, why is it that it's hard for these parents to get the sleep that they need? And then that's going to, at a minimum, just invite you to look at um, just childcare options, work options, housing options, and then all these other forces that are going to make it so that at 10 at night, parent either is able to go to sleep or is having to pull a night shift or is having to work at home or is having to like never actually shut down. And so part of like my part of why I am constantly um, trying to shift conversations to structural is not because I necessarily mean to sort of predetermine the answer to a
Mm-hmm.
question,
Mm-hmm.
but because I
Mm-hmm.
think too often do we focus on what individual people are or not are doing or aren't doing. And then if
Mm-hmm.
they're not doing something, it's like, all right, well, maybe you should, if you had a different approach or different attitude, or you um, did something differently, as opposed to, the structural approach where the insight or the instinct is that um, there are like rules or cultural practices or tendencies or policies that are built into the institutions that we inhabit that, um, except for those super rare circumstances, just reproduce, you know, the world as it is. And certainly, I think that applies to health and living a healthy life.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think, yeah, also just sort of disaggregating, but of course, like at the level of the individual or the um, communal, you could disaggregate those entities into, like you were talking about, the intellectual or the heart or the gut in different sorts of ways. Um, and so, yeah, which I think is all probably sort of helpful frameworks or rubrics just to in a more granular way disentangle the various sort of forces or dynamics that
Mm-hmm.
are leading either institutions to behave in a particular way or people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. I appreciate that. Humility and like the nudge, like there you I see that like cohabitating in you is you're like, I can see this and I can confidently say that we need to be thinking structurally, right? That we can't just be thinking individually, but not coming in like you might have these are some things I think that would be really good things to do, but really like just coming in saying, yeah, this is complex. And, but as we consider health, we need to, um, and you can tell me if this is some of what you're saying. I'm hearing that there's kind of a privilege that can, if you're thinking of things individualistically, then you're probably quite privileged.
Well, I actually not saying quite that.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Uh-huh.
I think that if you live a privileged life in the United States, it likely means that you either have benefited from some sort of intergenerational wealth transfer, you
Yeah.
received money from parents or others, um, or that you happen to have a job that pays you a significant amount of money. So you're buffered against all of the ways in which the government has essentially pulled out of supporting regular people. And so if you ascribe to an individualist account, then that is essentially justifying why your life is so much easier than most Americans. And
Yeah.
it's not necessarily um, meant to like malicious or even intentional, but in the way that we are all so engaged in so much motivated reasoning to maintain a positive sense of self and to often to justify the world as it is when it benefits us. There is an appeal, even if it's happening in some sort of subconscious way to an individualistic narrative. But you can also think of that with respect to like college admissions. Um, and so if you are someone who, because of social circumstance, benefited from everything from being able to access well-resourced schools to test prep to et cetera, and did work really hard, and so you were admitted to some fancy elite school, then to for the and then it turns out that most of the kids in that school also had your sort of background. There's a couple potential narratives. One is that, well, that school simply or largely or over relies on metrics in its admissions process that really just reward social advantage. Or it's that no, that school admits the best and brightest, and you are among the best and brightest, and you got here because you worked really hard. Now, it's likely that a lot of the people who got there did work really hard. But if our narrative is that they got there because they worked really hard, then it's suggesting that someone who does not have access to that conveyor belt didn't make it to the elite fancy place, and I'm gesturing to Harvard across the river here,
Okay.
um,
Okay.
trait. And, just in the sort of ecosystem of ideas and ideologies and narratives in the United States, this idea of success through individual effort, I think, is a dominant narrative.
Yeah.
Um, and so, um, and I don't think it is only held by individuals with privilege. I think it actually is far more sort of deeply laden into just our broader sort of cultural fabric. But I think that if you are someone who has benefited from different sorts of social advantage, there is a risk that you will unmindfully, just default to a narrative that, well, I deserve this because I worked hard. And again, I'm
Hmm.
not saying that you didn't work hard. Like
Hmm.
I worked really hard, but both of my parents were also physicians,
Yeah.
like, and who had access to different sorts of cultural capital and actual money, that without which my trajectory would have been different. Um, and but no, there's so many, uh, maybe not so many, but there's certainly um, a number of very powerful narratives in this country that I think often function to legitimize inequality.
Hmm.
Um, and part of
Mm.
the goal for me in teaching and learning is to try to, at a minimum, will name the narrative or name the assumption and then prove it. Like
Mm.
if we're gonna, to the extent, and I certainly, I'm not sure much of this country is in a sort of an intellectual um, orientation to much of anything.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
though that's not to say I
It doesn't,
think,
I'm not saying they necessarily have good, because your thoughts could be very, it
mhm.
doesn't mean you have good thoughts, but yeah, carry on.
um, but um, we have constant political fights in this country over like why is the world like why do things look the way that they look? And if the theory is, well, it's this way because the people who just have more wealth deserve it, I want some facts. Like,
Mm.
and you're not going to get much if you actually have a, thoughtful, comprehensive look as to why um, the world is the way that it is, and to just, like, um, yeah, to rely on lay theories about, I don't know, individual merit and talent, you know, intellectually, it's super dissatisfying because you're not actually
Mm.
engaging all of the powerful forces that actually structure our lives.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm going to be reflecting on this conversation for a while for sure. And I'll enjoy a re-listen to as I try to like kind of take in all the things that you're offering. So thank you so much. What would you say you're currently learning about living your healthiest life? You already maybe touched on some of this, but if we take that learning to like in real time, and you talked a bit about a friend that's kind of dropped some gems over time that you had to kind of contemplate for a bit before. But yeah, is there anything right now that you're learning about healthy living?
Hmm. The challenges of uh, healthy living, maybe. I guess, so for the first time in I'm not, I'm relatively not that old. Certainly have only been an academic in sort of this professional capacity for a few years, which is not long, but I'm certainly have been affected by the just totally toxic, often inhumane political environment that we're
Mm,
in, and just the ratcheting up of just really explicitly animus-laden, dehumanizing rhetoric and
yeah.
laws and physical
Yeah.
violence targeting different communities. Um,
Hmm.
it's Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a, and so I am in certain respects as insulated or buffered against the worst of what is going on in the country right now because I live in Massachusetts. So it's a super blue state. I'm a professor at Boston University, which is very protective both of academic freedom broadly, but also has a center of anti-racist research. And so
Hmm.
is,
Hmm.
in a top-down way, um, uh, committing to, broad fields of academic inquiry that are under attack in other places. Where if I lived in Florida now, like
Hmm.
I couldn't live a healthy life.
Hmm.
There's nothing like if you're in a Florida's just one example, but and so for me, what I've been grappling with in part through my scholarship to try to make sense both of what's happening now in the country, but then also why it seems often so hard to actually see in a clear-eyed way what's happening in this country, um,
Hmm.
is to try to really deliberately map some of the concrete actions that political and other forces and actors are taking now to what we saw in the 1960s and with backlash to Brown v. Board, which was 1954, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but then also going as far back as the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s. And, you know, the we are increasingly a country where your individual safety in a very real sense and inherent dignity is a function of the state you live in.
Hmm.
And I think
Hmm.
that, and that's really, I think, pretty destabilizing, especially if you grew up like I did, being sort of often implicitly, sometimes explicitly, though often implicitly, growing up in this notion of American racial progress
Yeah.
and progress broadly, just of this sort of um, uh, unavoidable linear movement to a society that was more inclusive and more just, um, anchored by civil rights. But I mean, because that's not the country we live in right now.
Yeah.
And there are, and if not, yeah, and so it is destabilizing to, yeah, to be in a country that is, it's in no way like most of the, yeah, looks in many ways more like the 1950s or the 1930s or the 1910s in a lot of key respects than the 1990s.
Hmm.
Not to say the 1990s were some golden age.
No, no, yeah. But if you're charting kind of progress or progression or regression, yeah, point taken. Um, yeah, I hope, that it's tricky. Like what you're bringing up is, yeah, you're saying destabilizing, right? And so there's kind of emotions that brings up in me of like, or just thoughts about like, okay, well, where does hope fit in, and where does as we because I think a little bit about that, like, okay, yeah, things, and then I have hope that there is like a revolution happening, that there are things, but it awakens these underlying infections, if we were to use like a metaphor, like of the human body, and apply it, on a country, or hopefully even globally. Hopefully there's like a awakening up and then exposing of this problem. And so it feels uncomfortable. It does feel unstable, but I'm hoping personally that it's more of a that it's not a regression, but it's just more of an exposing of where we had learned to put band-aids over things, that now we're going to actually address some things. And it's exposing people that are really not on board with any of what was going on, right? And yeah, 'cause otherwise things get really tricky, I guess, in terms of like living a healthy life when you don't have like the hope. Whew, yeah. That's some of what's getting stirred up for me. Um, but I think it is so important that we do take it is extremely sobering. And I think that's why it's so hard for so many white people to do this kind of work, right? Because it is very sobering to see our country for what it is, and to see like what that means for like the livelihood of people, and then you have to decide what you're going to do about it, right, on an individual, and like what steps are you going to take within your community. um thank you so much for that. So final question. So as we think kind of bigger, so what is something that you wish more people knew about living their healthiest life?
Oh, that's a good question. So I guess I don't necessarily feel um, like I have any special insight. I think I've certainly learned that my um, perspective or like own insight on what is uh, necessary for sort of, individual health shifts, and has shifted often as
Mm,
a um,
mm-hmm,
uh, byproduct of just shifting personal circumstance. Um,
mm-hmm,
and yeah, and just, increasingly appreciating how um, uh, sort of unstable the present often is. Um, and um, yeah, I don't know. It's not a very uh, you know, uh, robust response. I don't know. I think you said something earlier in the conversation about how we, often act in ways that um, are, not ways that we want to be acting. Um,
mm-hmm.
and I think that, yeah, so Kiese Layman is a Black author from Mississippi who was actually a professor at Vassar when I was there. But he wrote this memoir, Heavy, a couple years ago that appropriately got a ton of acclaim. And something that he engaged in that work and has elsewhere is how sometimes we are the worst to the people that we should be the best to.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and when I grew up, my and like, someone would say something mean to me or whatever, my mom would often respond by saying, well, it's about them, it's not about you. That
Mm-hmm.
doesn't make it feel any better. But
Mm-mm.
I think that there is a lot of insight there where if we are wanting to be personally responsible, not just to ourselves, but others, figuring out how to own and hold ourselves accountable when we are engaging in that way of the people who we should be the warmest to and the most generous with when we're the coldest to and the least generous toward, that it's probably not about them.
Yeah.
And figure, and
Mm.
it's if it's partly us, and there's something that I
Mm.
would imagine is somehow connected to not living in the healthiest sort of way. Um, uh, but yeah, so I don't know. Maybe that's totally non-responsive. Maybe it just opens up another um thought. But I don't know. I
Yeah,
guess
yeah.
yeah, because I think um and then another question is like, well, what do we actually have control over
Yeah, sure, sure.
individually?
Yeah.
Like, a lot of the structural stuff, like we actually like individual people are implicated in all sorts of ways, but maybe, as much as the question is, well, what could we be doing differently about us? Like, are there things that we can be doing to, you know, improve making it more possible for someone else to be living that healthy life?
Mm-hmm.
Um, or are we doing something that's, undermining uh,
Mm-hmm.
that prospect or possibility for someone? And does it happen to be one of those people in our life that we should be the best to, whether it's a partner or a kid or a sibling or a friend? Uh, and then, yeah, maybe my mom was also right that it's um, the person who, and then there's this, you might have seen it, this sort of silly, stupid movie, Bullet Train or something that got hyped on Netflix over the holidays or
Oh,
something that I
yeah.
watched
I
it.
don't know that one.
Brad,
Yeah.
yeah, so I, randomly, I think watched it one night. Brad Pitt is in it. It's,
Oh, okay.
sort of random movie.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just, interesting character, says a lot of lines. And he has this one line where he's like, I don't know, a trained assassin, but it's sort of a
Right.
comedy
Yeah,
sort of thing. And he's like, and someone like tries to kill him, and then he looks at them, he's like, or looks at the camera, he's like, hurt people hurt. Uh,
yeah.
and it's, it's like,
Yeah.
I probably shouldn't, maybe that's, maybe if that's where I'm going for my insight. But I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess there's just a link between the advice. Sometimes the basic, like just like basic stuff that can make it into that sort of movie and that sort of one-liner actually holds a lot of wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm hearing, and that resonates with me like I really believe like to change bigger things, we have to first start with ourselves, right? Because you could be the leader of amazing, and it happens all the time. If you think, like, we could just say religion, for example, like a religious institution, and if you have somebody that has really impact and they're doing all this good, and then you find out that their like moral character is not consistent with like what has been presented as like how they should live and how they've been telling other people, that it's fundamentally disruptive to a very large group of people. Whereas if that person had really focused and lived from a core outward, right, and then stepped into the leadership, but you're doing it from a place of integrity, that doesn't quite happen, right? That wouldn't be, it's like your influence, right? It's like, and it's kind of owning that your influence isn't, I'm thinking kind of, uh, it's, do what I say, not what I do, right? But really what people do and like just the being around us is like, it's like, how do we treat people? And it's not just the words that we say, but it's, how are we using our time and our energy? And so like you highlighting, um, your impact on the people closest around you. And I definitely absolutely believe in those ripple effects of that. Yeah, hurt people hurt. And so if those people around, if the inner circle around that person had been, more loving or supportive to help them through their hurt or cause less harm or like apologize for the harm that they caused, then yeah, maybe we wouldn't go around being quite so aggressive in LA traffic or it's probably pretty bad in Massachusetts, I imagine too. Um, but that seems true. And what you're saying, kind of like this core thing is like how and that prompts what I heard that as is like how are your actions impacting others? Are your actions, whether explicitly like what you're thinking that you're doing, and then implicitly like just as your behavior, how is that impacting other people's ability to live their healthiest life? And I think that is woefully under considered. um
Yeah, and then I mean, I'm sure there's going to be um, varied perspective on this, but I have to assume most of us have suffered some trauma in the past few years with the pandemic and everything that
yeah,
it has,
yeah,
and all the ways in which it's been at minimum disruptive. And so it means we're all hurt right now. And if hurt people
yes,
hurt, then
yeah,
what are we all doing to,
yeah.
collectively and individually, um, yeah, whether it's heal or deal with or navigate a time that remains traumatic in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think that's um poignant, and it kind of brings it back full circle, just how you, even as we started to get into health, that's kind of, it was like caveat, or like let's put it in the context of that. Okay, where are we historically? And some people would say like we're post pandemic, but I teach at a university as well, but I'm on the health sciences campus, right? And when I go over by the hospital, everybody has masks on, right? But when I treat in my clinic, it's just like a switch. You go to the grocery store, but even my clinic, increasingly, I'm having to hand out masks as people aren't having that expectation that there's still that risk. Nonetheless, students are getting COVID and having to like can't do their testing. They're still getting tested, and so there's some knowledge of it. Oh, we're still in a pandemic, right? And a patient be positive, and he can't be in. But there, like these different levels. Just bringing it back, I'm just trying to restate what you stated earlier of different levels of acknowledging, because people cope with stress in different ways, and this season has been long and incredibly stressful, and how some people are handling it is you just kind of tuck it away, right? And you just press on. And I can for sure the whew, like I lost my hope in humanity, like uh I was really struggling about like 8 months in, because I just thought we could come together and let's just all do our part. And then I was just like, no, people still want to go to Hawaii in the middle of this. And I'm like, what? All the, and there's just a microcosm. Like you can't stay away from people for a little bit, or you can't modify and get creative. And that's just like the health science knowledge I have, right? Because we know that if we can just suppress it, it's easier, and it's short-term suffering versus longer-term suffering. Um, but I think those are good reminders. So how I'm hearing like how are actions impacting other people's ability to live a healthiest life? And then let's not forget that we're historically where we're at with reference to the pandemic, however you label it. And we don't really have terms for it. And a lot of times when you're in the midst of something, you kind of forget that you're in the midst of something. And then it's not till somebody points it out or in hindsight that you're like, man, that was like a really rough season. Why did I struggle to do all those things? Oh, I struggled because this. And then you can look at it in that context and realize, oh, and that to me strikes as like a very helpful suggestion for people to do an inventory of like how the pandemic, I'm taking what you say and applying it, right? To like do an inventory of the pandemic and how it's affected you, or how it's affected the people closest around you. Because trauma is like, to address it, you have to like name it. And so, and that's part of healing, is just to even claim that you have like this difficulty in this struggle. And then I think from there you can take steps towards identifying what is next, because that will be very individualized. And we also need to be communally minded towards how we can help other people heal. And we know, yeah, right, because I'm sure you could just launch into it, right, of like how much bigger the gap is now in wealth. I've seen startling figures of just, the haves that now are even crazier having, and the have-nots, right, that are even more suffering. Any last words, John?
No, I think that was a nice way to um, sum it up. So I'll just leave it there.
No, thank you so much for sharing with us your insights and passion. I'm really excited about some of the book reads and race class. That's because for sure, like one of the things that I struggle with in my anti-racism journey is like integrating that, right? Like, how do I continue to move forward in my anti-racism journey and do it in a way that's sustainable? And so technology is so great, right? Our podcasts and all these things. So I'm really thankful for another resource. So thank you so much, John.
You're welcome.
And to everybody, may you always see the blessing. Thanks for listening to this episode of the LYHL podcast. If you liked what you heard, you can find me on Instagram at the Elle Bottrell, as well as YouTube, the internet, www.thellebottrell.com. And that's about it. And back here for our next episode of the podcast. Subscribe and leave a nice review if you think it'll be helpful for other people. Only then. Thanks. May you see the blessing.